Welcome to our deep dive into chip war. Get ready to explore the fascinating world of semiconductors. You might think it's just about tiny tech stuff, but you'd be wrong.
That's right. This book is really a journey through history. It shows us how these chips became so important, how they sparked innovation, and even caused power struggles between countries.
So before we get lost in all the technical details,
Yeah.
can you give our listeners a sense of why these chips are so crucial?
Well, imagine a world without oil. It would be chaos, right? That's kind of what could happen if we lost access to semiconductors. Think about it. They're the brains behind almost every device we use every day. Our phones, cars, even medical equipment. They're essential for pretty much everything.
Okay, wow. I'm starting to see just how important they are. So the book starts by talking about the shift from those old vacuum tubes to the transistor. Why was that such a big deal?
Vacuum tubes were like those old fragile light bulbs. They burned out all the time. The transistor was a game changer, though. Smaller, faster, way more reliable. It totally changed electronics.
You know what really struck me? Chip war connects this whole transition to World War II. It talks about people like Akio Morita from Sony and Morris Chang, the founder of TSMC. They both saw the destruction of the war. The book even describes it as a typhoon of steel, and their drive to rebuild using these tiny transistors. It almost feels like a response to all that devastation.
That's a great point. The book does a great job of showing that contrast, the old world of brute force versus this new world of technology. And Morita and Chang, they were shaped by their wartime experiences, and they were leading the way in this incredible shift.
It's amazing, though, because even with the invention of the transistor, there was still a lot of doubt about it. It's hard to imagine anyone doubting its potential today. What caused that initial resistance?
Well, there's this fascinating story about William Shockley. He was one of the inventors of the transistor. And he built this device to test how the transistor could control electrons. But his instruments were too primitive. They couldn't measure the tiny currents involved. So he just dismissed it. He said it was nothing measurable. Can you believe that? He completely missed the revolutionary potential right there in front of him.
Wow, talk about a missed opportunity.
Right.
But luckily, Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments saw what others didn't. He invented the integrated circuit in 1958. What made that invention so important?
That was the real birth of the chip as we know it. Multiple electronic components all packed onto a single piece of semiconductor material. It was a huge step forward. Kilby's integrated circuit paved the way for miniaturization and complexity that no one could have imagined back then.
It's amazing how even groundbreaking inventions like that can face resistance at first. So what finally convinced people of the integrated circuit's potential?
Believe it or not, it took NASA to really put chips on the map. They needed something compact and reliable for the Apollo program, and they chose Kilby's invention. It was a big gamble, but it paid off. Suddenly, if it was good enough to go to the moon, it was good enough for everyone.
That's quite an endorsement. And from there, things really took off,
Right.
especially with the emergence of Fairchild Semiconductor and Gordon Moore's famous prediction.
Absolutely. Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore co-founded Fairchild, and they played a critical role in advancing chip technology. Then in 1965, Moore made this prediction that became known as Moore's Law. He said the number of transistors on a chip would double roughly every year, leading to exponential growth in computing power.
And that prediction has been incredibly accurate for decades, driving the progress we've seen in electronics. It's mind-blowing.
It really is. And Fairchild, under Noyce's leadership, made another crucial move. They slashed chip prices.
Making them affordable for a wider market.
Exactly. That was brilliant. Making chips affordable was a key factor in the industry's explosive growth. It wasn't just about the technology, it was about making it accessible. And that fueled even more innovation.
Now, as chips became cheaper and more powerful, a global race for dominance began. Chip war dives into how Japan rose to prominence. They initially focused on consumer electronics while the U.S. was focused on military applications. How did that shape the industry?
It's a great example of how strategic choices impact an entire industry. While the U.S. poured resources into military tech, Japan was perfecting mass production. They flooded the market with affordable and high-quality electronics like transistor radios, and that eventually led to their dominance in the DRAM market, which is a key component of computers.
And this rise of Japan in the 1980s, that caused some real anxiety in the U.S., right?
It definitely did, and the book even mentions the Japan that can say no. It's a pretty controversial book, co-authored by Sony's Akio Morita and a prominent Japanese politician.
It's interesting how that book captured those anxieties and the shifting power dynamics.
Yeah, it basically claimed that Japan's technological power gave them leverage over the U.S. It argued that Japan could dictate terms in trade and even withhold critical technologies. It really sparked a lot of debate and highlighted the tension between these two economic superpowers.
Wow, that must have been a wake-up call. But the U.S. wasn't about to back down.
Definitely not. Silicon Valley always has some tricks up its sleeve. Under Andy Grove's leadership, Intel shifted their focus away from DRAM and towards microprocessors, and that move ultimately propelled them to dominance in the PC market.
So adaptability and a willingness to change course, that's crucial in the tech world.
Absolutely. Intel's story is a perfect example of how important it is to stay agile and anticipate market trends. But while all this was happening, another player entered the game, one that would reshape the entire industry, South Korea, with Samsung leading the charge.
And their entry into the DRAM market was pretty dramatic.
Yeah, you could say that Samsung was aggressive. They went after market share. They leveraged technology transfers from struggling U.S. companies like Micron. It's a fascinating example of how even rivals can end up helping each other, whether they intend to or not.
It sounds like the chip industry was already pretty cutthroat back then.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, what role did DARPA funding play in all of this? The book mentions it quite a bit.
DARPA, the U.S. military's research and development arm, played a vital role in fostering chip innovation. Think of it as a breeding ground for cutting-edge technology. They pushed the boundaries of what's possible. Their funding allowed researchers and companies to experiment and take risks, leading to advancements that benefited both the military and the consumer market.
So it wasn't just private companies competing. Government investment was a key factor in moving the technology forward.
Exactly. And the military applications of those advancements became really clear during the Persian Gulf War.
That's right. The use of precision-guided weapons, enabled by advanced microelectronics, was a game-changer on the battlefield.
It definitely was. It was a stark reminder of the U.S. military's technological edge, and it showed how important chips were becoming for national security.
So we got the U.S., Japan, and South Korea all battling for supremacy in the chip world. But there's another chapter to this story, right? One that centers around a new business model that changed everything, the foundry.
You got it. And this is where things get even more interesting.
This is where it gets really interesting. So we left off with this new business model, the foundry. What exactly does that mean, and how did it change things?
Well, the Foundry Model was really the brainchild of Morris Chang and his company TSMC. Basically, TSMC doesn't actually design its own chips. Instead, they focus entirely on manufacturing chips designed by other companies.
So they're like a high-tech factory for hire. What was the advantage of that?
It was revolutionary. Companies like NVIDIA, known for their graphics chips, could suddenly just focus on design, their specialty, without having to spend billions building and maintaining their own factories. Those fabrication facilities are insanely expensive.
So TSMC took on that burden, the financial risk of building those state-of-the-art factories. That must have made it easier for smaller companies to get into the game.
Exactly. It lowered the barrier to entry, so smaller players could compete and innovate without having to worry about the really complicated aspects of chip manufacturing. It led to a huge burst of creativity and specialization in the industry. TSMC basically created an ecosystem where companies could collaborate and push innovation even faster.
Chip war really emphasizes how important TSMC became to the global chip supply chain. It's kind of crazy to think about how many tech giants, even a company like Apple, rely on this one company in Taiwan for their most advanced chips.
It's definitely a situation that has both upsides and downsides. On the one hand, TSMC's dominance has allowed so many tech companies to grow and create these incredible devices. But on the other hand, having so much power concentrated in one company has raised concerns about geopolitical risks and what could happen if that supply chain gets disrupted.
Especially with China's growing ambitions in the chip industry. The book talks about how much they want to become self-sufficient, driven by economics and national security. But catching up to TSMC, they're the clear leader. That's not an easy task, is it?
Not at all. Building a world-class chip manufacturing industry takes mastering incredibly complex technologies. We're talking about pushing the limits of physics and engineering.
And the book really gets into the details on that,
Yeah.
especially when it talks about the challenges of EUV lithography. Can you explain that to our listeners and tell us why it's so crucial?
Imagine trying to draw these incredibly detailed circuits, but on a surface smaller than your fingernail? That's basically what chip manufacturing is like now. To achieve that level of miniaturization, you need incredibly precise tools. And that's where EUV lithography comes in. It uses extreme ultraviolet light to etch those microscopic patterns onto silicon wafers.
It sounds incredibly complex, and I understand it involves a lot of different companies, each one specializing in a specific part of the technology.
You're right. It's a great example of human ingenuity and international cooperation. You have ASML from the Netherlands. They're the only company in the world that builds the EUV machines themselves. Then there's Cymer, a US-based company that makes the special light sources needed for those machines. And then there's Zeiss from Germany. They provide the incredibly precise optics. Even Trumpf, another German company, plays a role. They build the powerful lasers that generate the EUV light.
Wow, so it takes a global village to create these cutting-edge chips that power our world. But all of this complexity and concentration of power, it creates vulnerabilities, right? Like the global chip shortage we saw in 2020 and 2021.
That shortage was definitely a wake-up call. It showed just how fragile our global supply chains are and how much we rely on just a handful of companies for these essential parts. The pandemic played a role for sure, disrupting production and logistics, but the underlying problems were already there.
And how did the U.S. government respond to that realization?
Well, the book talks about President Biden's push to increase domestic chip production. His administration has been trying to incentivize investment in U.S.-based manufacturing. They want to reduce our reliance on foreign suppliers. It shows that semiconductors aren't just about economic competition. They're crucial for national security, too.
Especially with all the tensions surrounding Taiwan. I mean, if something were to happen in that region, the impact on the global tech industry would be massive.
Absolutely. The book really makes that point clear. And it's not just hypothetical scenarios either, even seemingly small things like a fire at a key Japanese semiconductor plant or those ice storms that hit Texas. Those have caused major disruptions to the chip supply chain, and it has had a ripple effect throughout the global economy. It just highlights how interconnected everything is and how dependent we are on this delicate web of technology and global trade.
That's a pretty sobering thought. And as technology keeps advancing, with chips becoming even more important in fields like AI and autonomous weapons systems, the stakes are only going to get higher.
That's exactly right. Chip war makes it clear. We're not just talking about faster phones and cool gadgets. We're talking about technologies that are going to shape warfare and potentially change global power dynamics.
So it sounds like the chip war is far from over. It feels like we're just entering a new and even more intense phase. What insights does the book offer about this evolving landscape?
Chip war really shows us a world where power comes from these tiny pieces of silicon. It's a story of intense competition, strategic moves, and even moments where countries have to work together. But even with all that rivalry and the potential for conflict, the book also highlights how ingenious and resilient humans can be.
It's true. It's amazing how far we've come from those old vacuum tubes and transistors that had to be assembled by hand. It really shows how curious we are and how much we love to innovate.
And it's impossible to deny the impact this technology has had on our lives. Think about how much computing power we have today, all thanks to that constant pursuit of Moore's Law.
There's this quote from the book that really stuck with me. The history of the semiconductor is also a story of sales, marketing, supply chain management, and cost reduction. Silicon Valley wouldn't exist without the entrepreneurs who built it. It's a good reminder that progress isn't just about science. It's also about the people who bring those innovations to the market and make them something everyone can use.
Exactly. And that push to make transistors cheaper and more efficient has changed our lives in a big way. But the book also makes you think about the future. What happens when Moore's Law finally reaches its limit? What if those tiny transistors become too expensive or too complex to make?
That part about transistors costing less than a millionth of their 1958 price, it's inspiring, but also kind of unsettling. It makes you wonder, will we keep trying to make things smaller and more efficient forever? And what will that mean for us?
Those are some of the big questions facing the industry today. There's no guarantee that we'll find solutions to those challenges. And even if we do, those solutions might lead to new ethical problems and unintended consequences. The decisions we make now, as individuals, companies, and countries, will determine how technology shapes society in the future.
So what's the big takeaway from all of this? What should our listeners remember from our deep dive into chip war?
I think the most important thing to remember is this. Understanding that chip war isn't just for tech people anymore. It's about understanding the things that are shaping the world around us. From the devices we use to global politics, semiconductors are the foundation of the digital age. And whoever controls this technology will have a huge influence on all of us.
Chip War is a really interesting book, and I definitely encourage our listeners to check it out. It's a story about innovation competition and that human desire to push the limits. And as we've seen, the stakes are higher than ever.
The decisions we make today will determine whether this technology brings us together or tears us apart. It's a story that's still being written, and we're all part of shaping how it ends.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Chip War. We'll see you next time for another exciting exploration.